Joined by Megan Hope with the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network, I am curious because from the outside, the process for these separated families and people who are in the immigration system in general seems chaotic. It seems unorganized, a lot of mixed messages. What is it like on the inside?
I'd say it's very similar on the inside, both as an advocate, trying to get people connected with legal assistance and other services. It feels chaotic, and for the people that we're talking to in detention, parents who've been separated from their kids, it's also chaotic. I mean, there are just many things that that they don't, that they're not aware of that are going on, and that from the people that we have talked to, that's the way it's been, from the second they hit the U.S.
America's attention has just turned to the system that you're very familiar with. Mm-hmm. Does it seem like a lot has changed in the last year in terms of the way the system operates?
I would say yes and no. I mean, I think I would say things are certainly worse in many ways. I mean, from our perspective, they're worse in the sense that, the time I've been doing this work, I've never seen a policy where kids who entered with parents are taken away from them. We have certainly seen, in like 2014, when there was a large number of unaccompanied minors coming in. Of course, those kids, were being held in facilities and continue to be, unaccompanied minors. We also, a couple of years ago, saw really the rise of family detention centers. And I think each one of those developments has been difficult to deal with. I mean, there are just so many issues at play. But I think, one thing that to keep in mind, though, is that, immigration detention itself is not new. And immigration detention has always separated families to some degree, right? Like anybody who's in detention, even if they were already here with their whole family, are at least temporarily separated from their families. For years, we've seen people who come into the U.S. with some other family members, and at least adults are separated. We've also seen, a couple of years ago when the family detention centers were getting a lot of attention, what we would often see here is fathers who came in with their wives and children, and maybe the mothers and children were, either placed in a family detention center or released on their own recognizance or under an ankle monitor or something like that, but we would see the dad in detention. So that's all to say that there are dynamics of the system that I think are becoming really apparent to the general public now that have always existed to some degree. I mean, certainly family separation, and certainly I think just the very limited number of options that people who are leaving extremely violent and dangerous situations are faced with in terms of how can they practically get here and try to comply with the laws as much as possible. When
you talk about people leaving these situations, obviously that's why they're incentivized to take the great risk to break U.S. law if they enter illegally. You heard folks in the Trump administration talk about the idea of the tougher policy being a deterrent. It's only a deterrent, of course, if people know that the policy has changed. Do you get any sense that people fleeing Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico knew that the policy had changed?
I mean, no one that I have talked to in the recent weeks, or I haven't heard any of my colleagues talk about having spoken to people in detention who had any idea that this was happening. And I don't think that's surprising, because I think that, it usually takes like at least a month for somebody from Central America to reach the southern border. And so, they likely were not getting that information. I also, I heard a news report the other day about how at various times when other enforcement actions have been implemented, there have, the various administrations have tried to do public service announcements in Central America and Mexico and other countries. And I believe that what I heard was that that's not necessarily happening this time, or maybe not happening yet. So in any case, I think I would say that I would assume that most people did not know that this was happening. And honestly, I've also heard news reports that say that, people who are still back in those home countries indicate that, even though it's a terrible thing to think about, I mean, I think people are basically, they're in many practical senses, they're fleeing a war, and so and so even given some of these, even knowing that you might be separated from your child, I think to some people is going to seem like a risk worth taking when you are currently living in a situation where you are afraid that your child will be killed, where that seems really imminent.
Your organization has told us that you think there might be 50, 60 parents separated from their kids, the parents here at the Aurora detention facility. Not unusual that people who are separated at the border might end up here. For those folks, practically speaking, do they know where their kids are? If not, how do they find them? What kind of contact do they have with their kids?
Sure. So I think it has really varied. So we have spoken to a number of people who, it seems that probably the most likely thing is that at least when they first arrive at the detention center here, they don't know where their children are. They may know that their children are in one of these facilities, that they're under the custody of the government, but they don't know where. We have spoken to some people who have kind of gradually gotten that information. Usually it seems to be through like a social worker or a caseworker at an Office of Refugee Resettlement run facility, figuring out where the parent is and calling them. There are a number of other ways that people can find out. The Office of Refugee Resettlement recently set up a speed dial function in detention centers where detained adults can make a free call using the speed dial, call ORR, and I think provide some kind of basic information about themselves and supposedly get information about where their child is.
People are calling a hotline to find out where their kids are.
That is one function that, that's one means that has been provided to them. They also, I think are told that they can like write a message to their deportation officer, who's an ICE officer who's kind of assigned to their case, to also try to get information. But we've talked to people who, and we've talked to some people. Like, one of our attorneys is representing a woman who has been in the country for about 2 months, and during that time she's been in 5 different detention centers, I think before she arrived in Colorado, most of those were along the border. But she, it wasn't when we first met with her, which was just very recently, she did not know where her 6-year-old son was. She has since found out, but she went, at least 2 months without knowing that. And so it's a very, it's a very kind of piecemeal situation.
Yeah. So when parents get out on bond, when they have an opportunity to leave the detention facility, can they reunite with their kids then?
Yes, they're supposed to be able to reunite with their kids then.
Who pays for that? If the kid is halfway across the country, they're here, presumably neither of them have any money. How do they get back together?
Well, I'm not entirely certain, but my understanding is that the government would be paying for the child to be reunited with the parent.
Has anything changed from what you see for the recently separated families based on the President's executive order this week?
Not yet. I mean, cause, you're talking about like just since yesterday afternoon. No, not that I'm aware of. I've heard certainly a lot of questions being asked about, first of all, in terms of the people who have been separated, how are they going to be reunited with their kids? Are they going to be? When is that going to happen? And one other point that I'd like to make is that, not every parent who has been separated from their child is necessarily yet or necessarily going to be in a process where they are going to be able to bond out of detention. And this might get a little bit technical, but some people that we are seeing in this process of parents detained here who've been separated from their kids have been told that they are in what's called expedited removal, which is basically when somebody comes into the country without authorization. And it's usually when it's like their first time here, they have no parent tied anyone, and the government can make a decision that they do not have a right to appear in front of an immigration judge. And there are a number of ways that somebody can contest being put in expedited removal, and one of those is to assert a fear of return. And so that is what people typically do, and they're all supposed to be interviewed when they first come in if they have a fear of return. That normally happens, but we have seen some cases where people say that they were never asked that question. So they can still, once they get to the detention center here, assert a fear of return and then be put in a process where they will have an interview with an asylum officer who will make kind of an initial determination about their eligibility for asylum. But only once they assert a fear, have that interview, and only if they get a positive determination, a favorable determination on that just initial interview, is it that they might then be eligible for a bond to be released from detention. So,
on that issue of asylum,
yeah.
I feel, lost in a lot of the discussion over the last week is the change that Attorney General Jeff Sessions made, ruling out domestic violence and fear of gangs as that credible fear of return. Is that having an impact on the process?
I think it's a little bit too soon to say for certain, because most of the people that we have encountered in recent weeks who are in this situation being separated from their kids, I don't think have yet had their interviews with the asylum officers. But we are, we are worried about what kind of determination is going to be made during those interviews. I think that there are certainly legal arguments to be made that that people who are fleeing a domestic violence situation, at least could still be eligible for asylum. But I think it's going to be, it's a situation where it's more important than ever that people have access to legal representation whenever possible, because most people in the process of an asylum interview are not going to know all of the nuances of the law, right? Yeah. So,
last question in the limited time we have remaining.
Sure.
What's the biggest broad misconception that you think the public has about the way the system works?
Yeah, well, I think that I think kind of just going back to your initial question, I think that there is probably an assumption, and I think it's a reasonable assumption that that this is an orderly system. I mean, we hear a lot of talk about we want to trying to enforce law and order and whatnot, and I guess I would just say that it is a particularly chaotic situation right now, I think, with so many people not knowing where their children are, right? It's a very basic thing, but it is it's a behemoth of a system, and it's bureaucratic. There are a lot of things that happen, like we've seen in the last few weeks with this new policy that happen with very little notice, I think, to the agencies involved, and so. I guess I would just say that it's not an orderly system, and I think that there are just many opportunities within that for violations of due process. And the greatest one, of course, just being the fact that people who are placed in civil immigration proceedings are not entitled to an attorney at government expense. There's no public defender equivalent in the immigration system. So that means that even some of these kids who've been separated from their moms, these 6-year-old kids, they could potentially one day be going to court and being expected to represent themselves. So it is just it's a very unfair system in many ways, just by the very way that it's designed.
Megan Hope, appreciate your perspective. Please keep us updated, because I know people are interested.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.